Welcome to Grandpa Explains. Tonight we are going to slow down together and spend some time with one of the strangest, gentlest ideas a person ever set down on paper. It comes from a Swiss doctor named Carl Gustav Jung, and once you have heard it, you may find that you cannot quite look at your own anger the same way again, but there is no hurry about any of that. You do not need to know anything about psychology to listen. You do not need to remember a single word. There is nothing to figure out tonight, nowhere else to be, nothing to fix. You can let the words move past you like a slow river while your body sinks into the bed. So before we begin, take a slow, deep breath, let it out gently. Feel the weight of your head against the pillow, the warmth of the blanket, the small darkness of the room around you. Wherever you are, whatever hour it is where you are listening, let yourself settle in. We have a long, quiet night ahead, and Grandpa is in no rush at all. Let me start with a single sentence. Jung wrote it down many years ago, and I want you to hear it slowly, the way you might turn a smooth stone over in your hand. He said, "Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face." Read it again in your mind, only slower. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. Now that is a beautiful sentence, but it is also a riddle, and I do not want to leave it sitting there like a locked box. Let me open it the way I would explain anything to you, with an ordinary picture from ordinary life. Imagine you walk into a room, and there is a person you have never met before. Maybe they are at a family gathering, or in line at a shop, or simply a face on a screen. And before they have done anything truly terrible to you, and before they have stolen your wallet or insulted your mother, something in your chest tightens. There is a heat, a small, sour flame of dislike. The way they laugh, the way they hold themselves, the way they speak about themselves, something about it makes you want to grit your teeth. And the strange part, the part you have probably noticed and never quite explained, is that the heat feels too big. It is out of proportion. Other people in the room seem perfectly fine with this person. Only you are quietly burning. That heat, that disproportionate flash of fury at a stranger or a relative or a colleague who has not really wronged you. That is the doorway into everything we are going to talk about tonight. Jung would say that the intensity is the clue, not a clue about them, a clue about you. Because what Jung discovered over a long life of listening to people in his quiet consulting room in Switzerland is that the world we walk through is not as objective as we think. We imagine we are seeing other people clearly, like looking through a clean window. But Jung found that we are very often looking at a kind of mirror without knowing it is a mirror. The face that enrages us out there, in another human being, is sometimes a face we carry hidden inside ourselves. A face we have refused to look at, refused even to admit, is ours. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. The people who make us burn are sometimes screens, and what is projected onto the screen is a part of us we have never met. I know that may sound like a heavy claim to lay down on a sleepy night, so let me reassure you of something right away before we go any further. Jung was not a cruel man, and this is not a cruel idea. He was not saying that you are secretly a monster, or that everything you dislike is really your fault, or that you may never again trust your own judgment. We will be very careful tonight to keep the nuance, because the lazy version of this idea, the version you find shouted in 100 places now, is wrong, and it does real harm. What Jung offered was not an accusation, it was a kind of map. And a map, when you finally have one, does not shame you for having been lost, it simply shows you the country. So let me introduce you properly to the man and then to his strange and central idea. Carl Gustav Jung was a psychiatrist, a doctor of the mind, who spent his working life trying to understand why people suffer in the particular ways they do. why they break, why they heal, why they keep stumbling into the same trouble again and again as if pulled by an invisible string. And out of all his thinking, one concept has reached further into the ordinary world than almost any other. He called it the shadow. In his own German, der Schatten, the shadow. Now the word shadow can sound dramatic, gothic even, as if we are talking about something ghoulish lurking in a cellar. But Jung meant something quieter and far more human than that, and he defined it once with a phrase so simple and so precise that I want to give it to you exactly. The shadow, he wrote, is the thing a person has no wish to be. Sit with that for a moment, slowly. The shadow is the thing a person has no wish to be, not the thing you fear from outside, not a demon sent to torment you. It is the part of your own self that you would rather not own. The traits, the feelings, the impulses, the appetites that you long ago decided were not you. The pettiness you would never admit to. The envy you would be ashamed to name. The neediness, the laziness, the cruelty, the vanity, the hunger. Whatever it is, for each of us it is different, that you have quietly filed under not me. That filing away, that whole pile of disowned material, is the shadow. And here is the gentle hinge that the whole night will turn on, so let me say it plainly and let it rest in you. The shadow does not go away simply because we refuse it. That is the heart of the matter. When you decide that some part of yourself is unacceptable and you push it down out of sight, it does not vanish, it is not destroyed, it only moves. Let me give you a homely picture for that because it is the most important idea we will handle tonight. Think of the mind as a house and think of the things you do not like about yourself as furniture you have decided to get rid of. Now, in the physical world, if you do not actually carry the furniture out to the curb, it does not disappear. It just gets shoved into the spare room, or the attic, or down into the cellar where you do not have to look at it. The house feels tidier. The living room, the room you show to guests, looks clean and bright. But the old chairs and the broken lamp and the box of things you are ashamed of, they are all still in the house. They are simply in a room you have stopped entering. Jung's insight, the one I want you to carry into your sleep, is that the psyche works like this. Nothing in it is truly thrown away. What we refuse is not removed, it is relocated. The mind is, in this sense, a closed house. The mass is conserved. You can move the weight from the bright room to the dark room, but you cannot make it weigh nothing. And the dark room, the room you have stopped entering, that is the shadow. This is why the whole idea is so gentle in the end, even though it touches on dark things, because the shadow is not an enemy that broke into the house. It is your own furniture. It is made of the same wood as everything else you own. It came from you. It belongs to you. And the suffering, when it comes not because the furniture is evil, but because you have forgotten it is there, and you keep stubbing your toe on it in the dark and blaming the furniture for being where you cannot see it. Now, why call it the shadow? Why that particular word out of all the words Jung might have chosen? Here is where the name itself becomes a little gift, a small picture you can hold, and I want to offer it to you softly, not as the big idea, but as the atmosphere around the big idea. Think of your own shadow, the ordinary one, the dark shape that follows you on a bright afternoon. What is a shadow, really? It is simply the place the light does not reach. Your body stands in the way of the sun, and behind you falls a shape that is exactly your size and your form, only dark. It is not separate from you. It is attached to you at the heels all day long. It goes everywhere you go. And here is the strange and lovely part. You almost never see it. You walk forward toward what the light shows you, and the shadow falls behind, out of view, trailing after you faithfully and unseen. The only time you see your own shadow is when you turn. When you deliberately turn your back on the bright thing in front of you and look the other way, down and behind. Only then does the dark shape become visible, lying there on the ground, having followed you all along. Jung chose the word with care. The shadow of the psyche is just that. The part of you the light of consciousness does not fall upon. Consciousness is like the sun. It illuminates whatever you face, whatever you choose to look at and call yourself. And behind that lit-up, daylight version of you, attached and faithful and unseen, falls everything the light does not reach. It is not somewhere far away. It is right here, at your heels, your exact size, going everywhere you go. And like the shadow on the pavement, you will only ever see it if you are willing to turn around. That turning, that simple, frightening, healing act of looking behind you instead of always ahead, is the whole work we will be circling all night. But we are nowhere near asking you to do it yet. Tonight you only have to listen. The turning can wait for a daylight hour, if it ever comes at all. So let me lay down, very gently, 3 small mysteries, 3 loose threads that I'm going to leave dangling here at the start of the night, so that later, much later, we can come back and tie them off. You do not have to hold on to them. If they drift away as you grow drowsy, that is perfectly all right. I am only planting seeds, and seeds do their work in the dark, whether or not you are watching. Here is the first thread. The person who irritates you most, the one whose particular flaw makes you burn out of all proportion, is showing you something, but it is not what you think. You think they are showing you how flawed they are. Jung would say they may be showing you something else entirely, something much closer to home. We will come back to this. Here is the second thread, and it is a strange one, almost a warning. The harder a person tries to be only good, only kind, only pure, only rational, never angry, never selfish, never dark, the more dangerous that person may slowly be becoming. That sounds backward, I know. It sounds almost upside down. Hold it loosely. We will come back to why the most determined effort to be good can, if it is done in the wrong way, quietly manufacture the very thing the person was trying to avoid. And here is the third thread, the one I most want you to carry into sleep, because it is the kindest of the 3. Whatever you buried long ago in the dark room of the house, it did not die. It has been waiting. And here is the surprise, the thing almost everyone gets wrong. It is not all monsters down there. Some of what we exile in ourselves is not our worst. Some of it is our best. There is gold in that dark room, not only dust. But we are a long way from that part of the story, and it deserves the deepest part of the night, so let it wait. 3 threads then. The irritating person is a mirror. The effort to be only good can become dangerous. And what you buried is not all darkness. Let them lie there in the dark, doing their slow work. We will return to each. Now let me come back to that first thread and start very gently to pull on it, because the projection idea, the one we opened the night with, is really the engine of the whole thing, and I do not want it to stay a mystery any longer than it must. Remember the sentence, projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. And remember the heat in the chest, the disproportionate flash of fury at someone who has not truly wronged you. Jung said something that ties those 2 things together, and it is worth hearing in his careful language. He wrote that the projection-making factor is the shadow. The thing inside us that does the projecting, that throws our own hidden face onto other people like a slide thrown onto a screen, is the shadow itself. Let me make this as ordinary as a kitchen table because it deserves to be understood and not just admired. Projection in this sense is one of the oldest tricks the mind plays, and it is not a wicked trick. It is the mind trying to protect itself. When there is something in us we cannot bear to see, the mind finds a clever way to keep it hidden from us while still, in a sense, letting us look at it. It takes that thing, that disowned trait, and it lays it over someone else, like a projector in an old cinema. The reel of film is inside the machine behind us where we never look. But the image lands on the screen in front of us, large and bright, and apparently out there, in the world, separate from us. We sit in the dark, certain that what we are seeing is on the screen. We have entirely forgotten that the source of the picture is the small, warm, humming machine behind our own heads. So the trait you cannot stand to admit you carry, let us say, it is a kind of selfishness or a hunger for attention or a meanness you would die rather than confess. The mind takes that trait and projects it. It lands on the screen of another person. And now you can finally look at it. You can stare at it, study it, judge it, hate it, safely, because as far as you are concerned, it is out there, in them, and has nothing to do with you. That is the relief projection offers. It lets you see your own face without ever having to recognize it as yours. And this is why the fury is so disproportionate. This is the part that once you understand it, you can never quite unsee. When someone is simply annoying in an ordinary way, you feel a mild, manageable irritation, the kind that passes. But when someone happens to display openly and shamelessly the very thing you have spent your whole life burying in yourself, when they live out in the daylight the exact trait you shoved into your own dark cellar, the reaction is not mild, it is volcanic, it is moral fury, it feels righteous, it feels like the cleanest, most justified anger in the world, and that intensity, that strange excess of heat, is the fingerprint. Jung's collaborators, the people who learned this work directly from him, taught that an emotional reaction far out of proportion to its trigger is the diagnostic sign, i.e. the telltale clue, that you are not simply seeing another person. You are meeting your own projected shadow, wearing their face. I want to be very careful here because this is exactly the place where the lazy version goes wrong, and Grandpa will not hand you a wrong thing just because it is simpler. It is not true. It is not what Jung said. That everything you dislike in other people is secretly yourself. That is the cartoon version, and it is false, and it can be used cruelly to silence people who are seeing something real. Sometimes the irritating person is simply behaving badly, and your reaction is an accurate, healthy perception of a genuine fault. Some judgments are just true. The mirror is not an iron law, it is a frequent mechanism, not a universal one. So the question is never simply, do I dislike this person? The question, the more interesting and more honest question is this: is my reaction bigger than the situation deserves? Is there a heat here I cannot quite account for? Because it is the disproportion of the out of all proportion part that points back toward the dark room of your own house. Ordinary dislike points outward. Disproportionate fury points home. And so the first thread begins to come clear, though we will pull it tighter still later in the night. The person who enrages you most may indeed be showing you something. But the picture on the screen is being thrown from a small machine, humming quietly behind your own head, and the reel inside it, the film you have never watched, is made of you. Now you may already be feeling a small natural resistance to all of this. A part of you may be saying, no, surely not. Surely I know my own mind. Surely the things I hate are simply hateful. If you feel that, I want you to know it is not a failure on your part. It is the most expected thing in the world. Jung said, in his very careful way, that becoming conscious of the shadow involves recognizing the dark aspects of one's own personality as present and real, and that this act, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. Considerable resistance. He chose that phrase deliberately. The mind defends the dark room. It does not want the door opened. It would rather do almost anything, argue, blame, project, rage, than turn around and look at the shape lying on the ground behind it. That resistance is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that you are a perfectly ordinary human being with a perfectly ordinary house and a door you have, like all of us, kept closed. So do not strain against it tonight. There is nothing to push through. We are only walking slowly around the outside of the house in the dark, getting a sense of its shape, learning where the rooms are. We are not going to fling open any doors. That is daylight work, if you ever choose it. Let us pause here for a moment, you and I. Take a slow, deep breath all the way down and let it go without hurrying it out. Feel how the weight of your body has sunk a little deeper into the bed since we began. Notice the quiet of the room, the small, ordinary sounds of the night, the warmth gathered under the blanket. You have nothing to solve. You have understood nothing wrongly. There is no test at the end of this. There is only the slow voice in the dark and the long, soft road towards sleep. When you are ready, and only then, we will go on together. Because we have only just opened the box. We have named the man Carl Gustav Jung. We have named the thing, the shadow, der Schatten, the thing a person has no wish to be. We have learned the gentle law that the whole night turns on, that nothing in the mind is destroyed, only relocated, that the house conserves its weight, that what we refuse moves into the dark room rather than out the door. And we have begun to understand the strange machinery of projection, the humming projector behind our own heads, throwing our unknown face onto the screen of other people so that the heat we feel toward a stranger may be the heat of a long, unexamined recognition. But we have not yet asked the oldest question of all, and it is the one we will turn to next, slowly, when you are still with me. Where does the shadow come from? It is not something we are born with, fully formed. No infant comes into the world dragging a sack of disowned sins. The shadow is built, piece by piece, over the long years of becoming a person. It is made in childhood, in the ordinary, unavoidable, often loving process of growing up. And that is a tender story, the story of how every one of us, you included, came to have a dark room in the house at all. There was a time, long ago, when the house had no locked doors, when nothing in you was forbidden, when you had not yet learned which parts of yourself were welcome and which would have to be hidden away. And the way that changed, the slow, gentle, necessary, and slightly sorrowful way that every child learns to fold half of themselves away into the dark, is where we will go next, after you have rested in the quiet a little longer. There is a beautiful image for it, an image of a long bag that we drag behind us, and we will spend a good while with it. But not yet. For now, just breathe and sink and let the night hold you. The story is in no hurry, and neither am I. Stay with me, and we will keep walking slowly into the dark and gentle house of the self. Before we go any further into that house, let me sit with you a moment longer in the doorway, because there is something worth saying about the man who first drew the floor plan. His name was Carl Gustav Jung, and you do not need to know anything about him to listen tonight. He was a Swiss doctor of the mind, a man who spent his long life listening to people in the dark, listening to their dreams and their fears and the things they could not say in daylight. And somewhere in all that listening, he gave a name to the part of us we have been circling. He called it the shadow. In his own quiet German, der Schatten. The shadow. And the way he defined it is so plain that it can slip right past you if you are not careful. He said the shadow is simply the thing a person has no wish to be. Let that settle for a moment. Not the thing a person is not. The thing a person has no wish to be. The greedy streak in the one who prides themselves on generosity. The coward hidden inside the one who must always be brave. The cruelty folded away inside the one who would never, ever think of themselves as cruel. The shadow is not what is missing from us. It is what is present in us and unwelcome. What we have looked at somewhere along the way and decided quietly, no, not that. That is not me. And so we set it down in the dark room and closed the door. And after a while we forgot the room was even there. Here is the first strange thing, and it is the thing almost no one is told. When you set something down in that dark room, it does not vanish. It does not dissolve into nothing. The mind does not work that way. Think of it the way you might think of the world outside your window. Nothing in it is ever truly destroyed, only moved, only changed from one shape into another. Water becomes mist, mist becomes rain, rain becomes river again. Nothing leaves, and the psyche, Jung came to believe, obeys the same gentle law. What you refuse to be does not stop existing because you refused it. It only goes somewhere else. It only gets relocated. The anger you would not allow yourself does not evaporate. It moves to the back of the house and waits. And here is the part that makes a person sit very still when they first hear it. The more carefully you lock that door, the more you press against it, the heavier the thing behind it grows. Repression does not thin the shadow, it feeds it. The less of it you let into the daylight of your ordinary life, Jung said, the blacker and denser it becomes. Sit with that slowly. The blacker and denser, not smaller, not weaker, denser. As if the very effort of being only good, only kind, only pure, were a kind of pressure that compacts everything you have exiled into something harder and more concentrated than it ever was before. This is the loop I asked you to hold a little while ago, the one that sounds almost like a riddle. That the harder a person tries to be wholly good, the more dangerous, in a hidden way, they may slowly be becoming. We will open that all the way later when you are deeper into the night. For now, just let the strangeness of it rest beside you, the good intention and the darkening room, living in the same house. There is a reason Jung chose that particular word, shadow, and not some colder, more clinical term. He was a careful man, and the word was deliberate. Think of what a shadow actually is. It is not a thing in itself. It is the part of you the light does not reach. Stand in the sun, and your shadow falls across the ground, attached to you at the heel, following everywhere you go, and yet, and this is the quiet genius of it, you cannot quite look at it directly. It is always behind you in the direction you are not facing. You can turn and turn and turn again, and it slips around to your back each time, just out of sight. It is the most faithful companion you will ever have, and the one you will see the least. That is the shadow of the self, not a stranger who lives somewhere else. You, in the part of you that your own awareness has never shone its light upon, attached, faithful, following, and visible, when it is visible at all, only out of the corner of the eye, only for a moment, usually in someone else, because that is where it tends to appear, not in the mirror where we would have to own it, out there, in the other person. We will come back again and again tonight to that humming projector behind the head, throwing the unlit face onto whoever happens to be standing in front of us. Jung said something about this that I want to leave with you now, like a small stone placed in your open hand to hold while you drift. He said that projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. The world. The whole of it. The people in it, the ones we love and the ones we cannot stand. All of it slowly remade without our knowing into the likeness of the face we have never seen, our own buried face, looking back at us from everywhere, wearing other people's names. And so the irritating person, the one whose particular fault lands in you like a hook, the one who makes the heat rise in your chest out of all proportion to anything they have actually done, that person, Jung would say, is not only a person. They are also a mirror you did not ask for, a screen lit from behind by your own forgotten light. This is the loop I told you we would not pay off yet, and we still will not fully. I only want you to begin to feel its shape in the dark, that the one who irritates you most may be showing you something true, and that it is almost never the thing you think it is. But none of that, not the mirror, not the projector, not the dense and waiting dark, none of it is the place to begin. To understand why the world becomes the replica of our unknown face, we have to go back to the very first day the locked door appeared, back to the child who had not yet learned to fold anything away, and we will, soon. But first, breathe. Let the shoulders drop a little further from the ears. There is no door you must open tonight, nothing in your own dark room you are being asked to face. We are only walking past it, slowly, in the warm lamplight, naming the rooms as we go. There is a poet named Robert Bly who wrote a small book about the shadow, and in it he offered an image so plain and so true that it has stayed with everyone who has read it for 30 years now. He said that when a human being is born, they arrive carrying an invisible bag. Not a heavy one, not a frightening one, just a long, soft bag dragging behind them, and at the moment of birth that bag is almost entirely empty. Then the growing begins. Every child comes into the world with a whole self. Not a good self or a bad self, a whole one. The anger is there, and the tenderness, the boldness and the fear, the greed that reaches for the last piece of bread, and the generosity that hands it to someone else, the wild howling grief and the shrieking delight, sexuality, eventually, ambition, the urge to dominate and the urge to vanish, all of it, the full range, present and humming and available, because a child has not yet learned to be ashamed of any of it. And then the world begins to respond. This is not cruelty, not usually. It is just what happens when a small animal made of unlimited feeling meets a world made of other people who themselves have been shaped and pressed and reduced. A mother's face tightens when the child shows anger, and the child whose survival depends entirely on that face learns something, not in words. The child cannot yet hold words like lessons. The learning goes deeper than words, goes straight down into the body, into the structure of what feels safe and what feels dangerous. Anger made her face go cold. Anger, then, is dangerous. Anger goes in the bag. The father laughs uncomfortably when the boy cries, and the boy notices. He does not notice the way you or I might notice a fact. He notices the way a plant notices light, turning away from the cold side, curling toward the warmth. Tears made him uncomfortable. Tears are not safe here. Tears go in the bag. The teacher says in front of the class that the child is showing off. The child was only excited. The child was only bursting with something urgent and alive, some idea that felt enormous and true. But showing off is shameful, and the child learns this in one moment completely and does not forget. The excitement that reached outward that big unguarded reaching. Into the bag it goes. And so it continues for years, for decades. The religious tradition that says sexuality is something to contain, the family culture that says real strength does not ask for help, the neighborhood that says art is for people with too much time on their hands, the unspoken household rule that says we are a family that does not cause a fuss, we are a family that copes quietly, we are a family that does not want and does not grieve loudly in front of company. All of it goes in the bag. Bly's image, and it is his image, but let me be clear that this is Robert Bly writing in his book, a little book on the human shadow, published in 1988. Bly's image is that we spend roughly the first 20 years of our lives filling that bag. Every year the bag grows heavier. Every year the child becoming a young person, becoming an adult, has less and less of their original wholeness available to them. More and more of what was once alive and present and real has been zipped away into the dark. And then we spend the next 40 years, he said, trying to get it back. That is the childhood formation beat, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on, because it changes the meaning of the shadow considerably. The shadow is not the arrival of something foreign. It is not a demon that crept into you from outside. It is you. It is the parts of yourself that the world around you could not hold. And so you hid them. And you hid them so well and so early that you forgot they were yours. You forgot they were there at all. You only know dimly that there are rooms in yourself where the lights are off, and you learned long ago not to walk down that particular hallway. Jung described this sorting process in terms of the developing ego. The ego being, in his framework, the center of consciousness, the part of us that says, I am this person, I do these things, I feel these things, I value these things. The ego is what gets built across childhood, and the way it gets built, he wrote across his work in the Collected Works, Volume 9, Part 1, is through precisely this sorting. Experience is divided into what the ego can hold and identify with, what feels like me, and what it cannot hold, what it must reject, what is labeled not me. This is the mechanism. The psyche does not destroy the rejected material. The psyche cannot destroy anything. You can no more eliminate a piece of your own emotional nature than you can eliminate a room from a house by nailing the door shut. The room is still there. The things in the room are still there. The door just no longer opens from your side. That is the conservation principle. Nothing is lost, only relocated. The rejected pieces do not evaporate. They form the shadow. Marie-Louise von Franz, who was Jung's closest collaborator and one of the most careful thinkers his tradition produced, wrote about this in Man and His Symbols, the 1964 volume that Jung himself edited and contributed to directly. Von Franz explained that the shadow contains those qualities and impulses that the individual denies in themselves, and critically she noted that the shadow is not a collection of things that are simply bad or evil in some absolute sense. It is a collection of things that the particular person, in their particular life, in their particular family and culture, has been unable to acknowledge as their own. What goes in the bag is different for every person. For one child it is anger, for another it is softness, for one it is ambition, for another it is the desire to be small and protected, for one it is sexuality, for another it is the refusal of sexuality, the need for solitude, the part that does not want to be touched or known. The specific contents are as individual as the life. What is universal is only the mechanism. Some things go in, and we forget they went. Now here is where Jung introduces a second idea, and the two together are more powerful than either alone. He called it the persona, and the word itself tells you everything you need to know if you happen to know Latin or the history of theatre. Persona is the Latin word for the mask worn by an actor in the ancient Roman theatre. not the face. The mask. The thing held up in front of the face so the audience knows who this character is. The thing that speaks and emotes and signifies while the real face behind it remains unseen. Jung wrote about the persona in his 2 essays on analytical psychology, collected in Volume 7 of the collected works. The persona, he said, is the social face we present to the world. It is the mask of the good employee, the reliable neighbor, the patient parent, the competent professional. The persona is necessary. Jung was not saying the mask is evil. We need ways to move through social life, and the persona provides that scaffolding. Without any persona at all, a person would be unmanageable for themselves and for everyone around them. But here is the thing about a mask, the thing that matters for our purposes. When you put on the mask, something goes behind it. The mask presents one face, and the face it hides goes somewhere else. The something behind it does not disappear. It gets pressed backward, out of sight, into the dark. And the principle Jung held is a kind of conservation. What you put into the persona on the front side, you push into the shadow on the back. The brighter and more polished the mask, the more is forced into the dark. The more you insist on being seen as purely kind, purely rational, purely selfless, purely controlled, purely whatever the ideal is, the more you must press down and lock away every impulse, every feeling, every trait that does not fit that particular bright story. This is why the person who seems most virtuous is sometimes the most dangerous, not always. I want to be precise here because the nuance matters. Not every kind person is secretly monstrous, and I am not saying that. What I am saying is that a person who is compelled to be seen as only kind, for whom the mask of kindness is not a social tool but an absolute necessity, an identity so total that any crack in it represents catastrophe, that person has paid for that mask at enormous cost. Everything that is not kindness in them, every moment of selfishness, every flash of cruelty, every ordinary human irritation and contempt and desire has gone behind the mask, into the bag, into the dark. And it has not gone quietly. It has gone under pressure, compressed, growing denser, and it is waiting. There is a particular pattern that appears in this situation. The person who is known for an almost preternatural sweetness, a goodness so consistent it seems inhuman, who then does something that shocks everyone who knows them, a cruelty that seems to come from nowhere, a betrayal that no one saw coming, a sudden breaking that appears to contradict everything the person was understood to be. And the people around them say, "We had no idea, we never would have guessed. This is so unlike them." But it is not unlike them. It is precisely them. It is the part of them that the mask was built to hide, and it was always there, and it was always gathering force. And the mask eventually could not hold it anymore. The brighter the mask, the darker the shadow behind it. But this is not a metaphor. This is, in Jung's framework, a structural observation about how the psyche works. The quantity of material that cannot be held in consciousness does not shrink because we deny it. It grows. We will come back to that growing in a little while when we talk about what happens when the shadow does not just press against the mask from behind, but breaks through it, and not only in one person, but in the life of entire groups, entire nations. That door is ahead of us. We will not rush toward it. For now, let us stay with the personal, with you and the people you know, and the quiet rooms inside each of you. There is a rest pause here. Take a slow breath. Feel the weight of where you are lying, the particular softness or firmness beneath you. Notice that your hands may have unclenched slightly while we were walking through all of this. The childhood, the bag, the mask, the pressing down of the unacceptable. That unclenching, if it is there, is the right response. None of what we are naming tonight is accusation, it is description. Every human being in this world is carrying the bag. Every human being is wearing some version of the mask. You are not being told you are broken. You are being told you are human, in exactly the way humans are. When you are ready, we will continue. Now, back to the shadow and to the question that is probably closer to the surface for most of us than childhood formation theory. Because the childhood part, important as it is, can still feel a little abstract. It can feel like something that happened to other people or like something that happened a long time ago and is finished. And the point Jung was most insistent on is that it is not finished. The shadow you formed in childhood is with you now, tonight. It has traveled with you invisibly through every year since, and it speaks to you regularly in a particular voice, in a particular emotional register, and the voice is almost always heard as someone else's. This is projection. We began to feel the shape of projection in the first part of our walk tonight, but let us look at it more carefully now because it is the hinge everything else turns on. The basic mechanism, the psyche has sealed certain traits into the shadow. You cannot see them directly because they are behind the door, in the part of the house where the lights are off. But they do not stay sealed. They press outward the way water presses through a cracked dam, and they find an exit. The exit is other people. Specifically, they find people in whom the shadow trait is visible, actively expressed, or something that seems to hint at it. And the psyche throws the trait onto that person, lights it up, and reads it as entirely belonging to that person, and not at all as belonging to you. The person becomes a screen. The shadow is the projector. The image on the screen looks like reality. It looks like an accurate perception of another person's actual quality. But it is partly, sometimes largely, a picture your own psyche is casting onto them. Von Franz gave us the diagnostic fingerprint, the way to tell when projection is happening rather than ordinary perception. She described it in Man and His Symbols. And it is this: when the emotional reaction you have to another person is disproportionate to what the situation actually warrants. When the intensity of what you feel exceeds, clearly and uncomfortably, what the trigger should logically produce. That disproportionate charge is the signature of projection. Think about this carefully because it is both simple and difficult to accept. Ordinary dislike, ordinary irritation, ordinary disagreement. These feel a certain way. They are real, they register, and then they fade. They do not haunt you. They do not come back when you lie down to sleep. They do not make your face go hot when you merely think of the person 3 days later. They do not give you a satisfaction that you're slightly ashamed of when something bad happens to that person. Ordinary perception of another person's real flaw feels more or less proportionate to the flaw, but meeting your own shadow in another person feels like something else entirely. It feels like moral fury. It feels like a righteousness that is almost pleasurable in its intensity. It feels like something you cannot let go, cannot make smaller, cannot respond to with the mild reaction that the situation logically calls for. Someone is arrogant, and you find yourself unable to stop thinking about how arrogant they are, returning to it again and again, crafting arguments against them in the shower, in the car, at 2 a.m. when you should be asleep. Someone is selfish, and their selfishness becomes almost an obsession, a touchstone of awfulness you return to without meaning to. That is not ordinary perception. That intensity is a signal. Von Franz was specific about this. The disproportionate reaction is the diagnostic fingerprint, the moment the thermometer runs too hot for the weather outside. And what it is a fingerprint of is your own shadow trait, alive in the other person or appearing to be, visible out there in the light while it sits locked in the dark inside you. The fury is partly the fury of recognition of something familiar and forbidden, something that resonates at a frequency you know from somewhere deep. something the body recognizes even when the mind does not. There is a phrase widely attributed to Jung, and the core idea is genuinely his, well documented in his writing, though the exact polished wording is slightly smoothed in popular use, that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That sentence is the whole of it, compressed into a single line. The irritation is not irrelevant, it is not merely uncomfortable noise, it is data, it is pointing at something. And the something it is pointing at is almost never what we think. We think it is pointing at a flaw in them. It is usually, when the charge is disproportionate, also pointing at a room inside us. Now the shadow also shows up in another place, one that von Franz noted with particular care. It appears in dreams. When the shadow wants to become visible, and there is something in the psyche that seems to want this, that seems to push the shadow toward consciousness even when the waking mind resists, it uses the images of sleep to make itself known, and it tends to appear in a particular form. Von Franz described it as a same-sex figure of inferior or threatening character, not the monster, not the cartoon villain. Something more uncomfortable than that. A figure who is your own sex, your own approximate type, but who does something you would never do or who represents something you particularly despise. The criminal who looks unsettlingly like you, the bully who shares your face but uses it differently, the traitor, the coward, the narcissist who appears in the dream as an identifiable familiar presence. Someone you might even know, or a stranger who is somehow too familiar. These figures, von Franz taught, are not arbitrary. They are not the psyche playing random images. They are the shadow, stepping into the light of sleep because you have let your guard down enough to allow it. If you have ever woken from a dream disturbed not by what happened in it, but by what you felt in it, if you have ever been troubled by a dream in which you did something terrible, or in which someone who seemed to represent you behaved in a way that made you feel sick or frightened, that is the shadow making itself known. Not as a diagnosis, not as a verdict, as a knock on the door. The dream is the psyche saying gently, in sleep, here is what you have not yet looked at. Here is a face you have not yet turned toward. We will not solve that tonight. We will only note that it is there, and that you do not have to open the door right now. But the dream, when it comes, is not your enemy. It is information that the daytime mind refused to receive, delivered through the only channel the shadow has access to. There is another place the shadow most reliably shows up. And it is a place that, if you are in a long relationship of any kind, will probably feel familiar in a way that carries some discomfort with it. We project the shadow most reliably onto the people closest to us. This makes a certain kind of sense once you understand the mechanism. Strangers are screens that are too small. We do not have enough contact with them, enough intimacy, enough access to their particular being for the projection to land with full force and stick. We can dislike a stranger or a public figure intensely, and that can certainly involve shadow projection. We will come to political figures and nations later in our walk tonight. But the projection that cuts deepest, the one that transforms completely and reorganizes the emotional landscape, tends to happen in intimacy. With the partner, with the closest friend, with the family member who knows you best and therefore offers the most surface area onto which the shadow can write its story. This explains something about the particular alchemy of falling in love that has puzzled everyone who has ever fallen in love and then fallen out of it. The early stage of romantic love, the stage where the other person seems almost impossibly perfect, where their particular presence seems to fill something in you that you did not even know was empty, where you cannot quite believe that this exact person with these exact qualities exists and has come to you. That experience, Jung and the Jungian tradition suggest, is not only love, it is also projection. You are seeing partly your own unlived wholeness in the other person. The qualities they carry that you find most irresistible are often the qualities that are alive in them and sealed in you. She seems so free, and you are the person who spent 20 years learning to be responsible, and freedom went in the bag. He seems so completely at ease with emotion, and you are the person who learned very young that emotion is a vulnerability, and ease with feeling went in the bag. They seem so confident, so unafraid of taking up space, and you have a whole archive of memories of learning to make yourself smaller, and that confidence is behind the door. In the beginning, you experience this as attraction, as completion. The other person seems to have what you need, and being near them feels like being whole. This is not a lie, it is, in a real sense, true. But it is only partially about them. You are also encountering yourself, the unlived version, the parts of your wholeness that went in the bag, now walking around in another person's body and feeling from the outside like grace. And then the projection shifts. It always shifts eventually, because the other person is a real human being, not a screen, and real human beings do not hold still and go on indefinitely carrying only the traits we have projected onto them. They live, they change, they reveal themselves more fully, and the traits you have projected begin to detach from reality, and when they detach, when you can no longer see in the other person the shining completeness you once saw, the shadow projection does not simply disappear. It flips. The same intensity that was in the love is now in the contempt. The same quality that once seemed like their most beautiful trait now seems like their most infuriating one. The freedom that once felt like fresh air now feels like irresponsibility. The ease with emotion that once felt like warmth now feels like weakness or manipulation. The confidence that once felt like shelter now feels like arrogance. And the disproportionate charge is still there. The fury that comes in a marriage after many years, the contempt that has settled into the ordinary days like weather, that too has the signature of projection. That too is running at a temperature that the situation does not entirely explain, because you are not only reacting to them anymore, you are reacting to yourself, to the sealed room, to the bag that has been dragging behind you for decades, to all the things you cannot be that they appear, from your point of view, to be with infuriating ease. There is a particular kind of argument that couples have, not all couples, but many, where the heat of the argument exceeds what the original disagreement can account for. You both know this feeling if you have been in a long relationship. The argument begins about something ordinary and then finds its way somehow to a place that feels existential, that feels like it is about something enormous and old, something that has been there for years beneath the ordinary days. And often it is, often it has been, often what the argument is actually about, underneath the dishes and the forgotten appointment and the tone of voice, is the shadow. Your shadow and theirs meeting in the only space you have available, which is each other. This is not an excuse for unkindness. I want to say that clearly. Understanding that an argument has shadow roots does not make the argument acceptable or the cruelty in it harmless. It does not mean there is no real conflict to be addressed or no real fault to be acknowledged, but it does mean that some part of what is happening is not between the two of you at all. Some part of it is inside each of you, and the other person has simply become the screen onto which the oldest, most compressed, most unfaced parts of you have been written. The partner who once seemed like your wholeness has become the face your unknown self wears. The world, or even the small, intimate world of a marriage, a friendship, a family, has become, in the exact words Jung used in Aion, the replica of your own unknown face. Take a slow breath here. You do not need to solve your relationships tonight. You do not need to go back and recount every argument through this lens right now. We are only naming what is, only walking through these rooms with the lamp held low and steady, not bright enough to hurt, just bright enough to see by. The shadow is there. It formed when you were young before you had words for it. It lives behind the mask you built to meet the world. It shows up in the dreams that wake you at 3 in the morning with that particular discomfort. It shows up in the specific, disproportionate heat you feel for certain people. And it shows up most fully, most reliably in the people you love most, because loving someone is the act of dropping enough of your guard to let your own deepest material reach the surface, and it reaches the surface wearing their face. None of this is the end of the story. We have more rooms to walk through tonight. The story of what happens when the shadow does not only color the intimacy between two people, but scales outward into something larger and more frightening. The story of what the shadow does when it finds not one screen but a whole crowd of them, when it moves from the bedroom and the marriage into the public square and the government building and the history books. But we are not there yet. Let the night do its work. Let this settle in the body the way sediment settles in still water, slowly, not violently, until what was cloudy becomes clear. The irritating person is still showing you something. The dream figure is still standing at the door. The old argument is still beneath the surface of the ordinary day. And somewhere in the bag you have been dragging behind you since childhood, there is something you forgot was yours. We will get to what that something is later in the night. I can tell you now that it is not only darkness in there. There are things in that bag that you will be glad to find. Things that were not put away because they were evil, but because someone, somewhere, was not able to hold them for you. We will open that part of the story when we arrive at it. For now, let the shoulders drop. Let the breath slow to its own natural rhythm, whatever that is, however long it takes. There is nowhere to rush tonight. We are in no hurry. The rooms are here, and the lamp is still lit, and Grandpa is still walking beside you, and we will keep going together for as long as the night requires. There is a man Jung wrote about, not by name but by type, whom almost everyone recognizes. He is the man who has worked very hard for most of his life to be good, genuinely good, not performatively good, not good for the sake of reputation, but good in the way a person can be when they have set their jaw against their own darkness and refused its entrance. He gives to charity. He is patient with his children mostly. He volunteers. He speaks carefully about other people and does not gossip, or at least tries not to. He meditates or prays or both. He reads the right books, and when anger rises in him, which it does, he pushes it back down, because anger is not what a good man feels, or at least not what a good man shows. When he wants something that seems selfish, he finds a way to want something else instead, something more acceptable, something he can admit to at the dinner table. Year by year, decade by decade, he has been building the mask, and it is a very fine mask, clean and composed and admired by everyone who knows him. And then one day, he explodes. Not at anything large. Sometimes it is something trivial. A tone of voice, a particular colleague who cuts corners at work, a neighbor who leaves the trash bins out too long. And what comes out is not proportionate annoyance. What comes out is something that has been accumulating behind a dam for 30 or 40 years, dark and concentrated and hot, and the people around him are shocked because this is not the man they knew. He is shocked too. He did not know this was in him because he was so committed to being the man who did not have this in him. This is the mechanism Jung was pointing at when he wrote in Psychology and Religion, in the 11th volume of his collected works, paragraph 131, the line that is perhaps his most unforgiving and most merciful observation about human nature. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Read that twice. Not because it is difficult, but because the second reading usually lands somewhere the first one did not. The shadow does not thin out from neglect. It concentrates. The attempt to be purely good, to keep the mask perfectly polished, to refuse every dark impulse its moment in the light, does not diminish the shadow. It fattens it. The man who presses his anger down for 40 years does not become an angrier man by temperament. He becomes something stranger and more dangerous. He becomes a man who does not know where his anger is, which means he cannot steer it, which means it goes where it goes without his supervision. And where it goes usually is outward, toward a screen, toward whoever has the misfortune of standing in the light in exactly the wrong way on exactly the wrong afternoon. This is the counterintuitive heart of everything Jung said about the shadow, and it is the part that the self-help literature, with its cheerful exhortations toward positivity and light, so reliably gets wrong. You cannot empty the shadow by filling the conscious self with goodness. The psyche is not a glass you can drain. It is more like a system where pressure is conserved. Push something down here, and it does not disappear. It relocates, it builds, it waits. Think of it this way because a picture is sometimes worth the trouble. Imagine a room with a sealed door on one wall and a set of ordinary rooms behind you. Everything you cannot look at, everything you were taught not to feel, every impulse that was met with disapproval or shame or silence gets pushed through that door. You turn the lock. And for a while, the room is quiet, and the ordinary rooms are pleasant and presentable, and you can have guests over without embarrassment. But on the other side of the door, nothing is dissipating. The room is getting fuller, and one day the pressure is high enough that the door comes open on its own, not when you chose it, not when you were ready, not in a setting you would have selected. The more tightly you hold the door shut, the worse it is when it opens. That is what Jung meant by blacker and denser. The very effort of containment is what concentrates the material. This is not an invitation to stop trying to be good. That would be a lazy reading, and we will return to what the correct reading is in a little while. But first, it is important to sit with this discomfort because it is a real one, and it is discomforts like this that the mind most urgently wants to explain away. The good news, if you can call it that, is that this mechanism is not a personal failure. It is structural. It is how the psyche works, not how bad psyches work. The man who explodes at the trash bins is not a secretly terrible person who fooled everyone. He is a person who followed the instructions he was given, which were to sort himself into the acceptable and the unacceptable, to present the acceptable, and to manage the rest. The instructions were wrong, or at least incomplete, but he followed them in good faith. Almost everyone does. Let us take a slow breath here. Feel whatever is in the chest, and let it be there. We will keep walking. There is a newer name for a specific version of this problem, a version that has become very common in a certain kind of spiritually inclined person. The psychologist John Welwood, writing in the decades after Jung, gave it a name that has since become useful: spiritual bypassing. It works like this. A person encounters real pain, real shadow material, real inner conflict. And instead of turning toward it, they turn toward the light, the practice, the philosophy, the community. They begin meditating seriously. They speak about love and compassion. They read the mystics and attend the retreats. They adopt a vocabulary of openness and non-attachment and inner peace. And all of this can be genuine and meaningful. But sometimes it is also being used quietly as a way of not looking at the thing in the sealed room. The spiritual practice becomes the lock on the door rather than the courage to open it. Welwood noticed that people who were most earnestly pursuing light sometimes had some of the thickest shadows because the very vocabulary of their tradition made it easier to name what they were aspiring toward and harder to own what they were running from. Anger became not who I am anymore. Envy became a lower vibration I have moved past. The darkness was reframed, renamed, spiritualized out of existence, while behind the locked door it was getting denser. Jung would not have been surprised. He observed the same mechanism in the religious life of his era, which is why he wrote so carefully about the dangers of one-sided ideals, about the psyche's insistence on compensating for every exaggeration of the light with a corresponding intensification of the dark. Wellwood gave it a modern name. The dynamic was ancient. The shadow pushed away in the name of peace does not become peaceable. It becomes the shadow of someone who considers themselves above it, which is perhaps the most fortified shadow of all. We are going to need to follow this thread now into larger rooms, because what we have been talking about up to this point has been the shadow of a person. And the person is important, and the person's shadow is real and consequential, and we will come back to the person before the night is over. But Jung understood and wrote about at considerable risk that the same mechanism does not stop at the edges of one individual life. It scales. In 1957, Jung published a book called The Undiscovered Self, in the 10th volume of his collected works. He was 82 years old. He had lived through 2 world wars. He had watched from his home in Switzerland what happened when the interior logic of millions of people, each carrying their individual shadows, was organized and given a collective direction. And what he wrote in that book is among the most sober and important things he produced. Jung's argument was this: nations, like individuals, have something like a persona, a public face, a myth they tell about themselves. The myth of the noble founding, the righteous cause, the exceptional people, the innocent history. And just as the individual persona forces its opposite into the shadow, the national persona forces the national shadow into the dark as well. The atrocities, the hypocrisies, the buried cruelties, the things the nation did that it does not teach in its schools, does not include in its monuments, does not name at its celebrations. And when the shadow is not named, when the national myth is maintained too tightly, too purely, too righteously, the same mechanism operates that operates in the man who explodes at the trash bins. The pressure builds. And when it is released, it is not released proportionately, in manageable increments, with awareness and choice. It is released all at once, aimed outward, aimed at whoever can be made to carry it. This is what the scapegoat is, not just a metaphor, not just a figure of speech. The word comes from a specific ritual described in the book of Leviticus, one of the oldest books in the Hebrew tradition. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest would perform a ritual in which the accumulated sins and impurities of the whole community were symbolically transferred onto a goat. The sins were confessed over it, laid upon it. And then the goat was driven out into the wilderness. The community was clean. The darkness had been relocated, put into another body, sent beyond the boundary. The ritual is ancient. The psychology is modern, or rather, the psychology is ancient too, and Jung's achievement was to name it clearly. What Leviticus performed as sacred ceremony, every crowd that has ever turned on a minority group has performed as social psychology. The same dynamic, the community's disowned material, its fear, its violence, its greed, its lust for power, is collected and assigned to the designated outsider, who now carries it all. The community is clean. The outsider is destroyed, and the shadow, of course, is not actually resolved. It is only hidden, temporarily, under a different stone. Jung wrote about this directly in relation to what he had witnessed in Europe. In the essay, After the Catastrophe, written in 1945 as the full scale of what Germany had done was becoming visible to the world, he turned to his own framework not to explain it away but to explain it precisely. He argued that the Nazi movement was not simply a political phenomenon, It was a psychological one. It was what happens when a collective shadow accumulated across generations, charged with resentment and humiliation and unfaced grief, is given a symbol, a direction, and permission. The projection mechanism that causes one person to see their buried fury in a colleague's minor rudeness is the same mechanism that causes a nation to see its disowned darkness in an ethnic minority, a religious group, a neighboring country. The content changes, the architecture is identical, the shadow must go somewhere. If it cannot be turned inward, examined, integrated, it will be turned outward, and the screen it finds will receive not mild irritation, but something that has been pressurizing for years or decades or centuries. He wrote in The Undiscovered Self that mass movements allow individuals to discharge their personal shadow with a clear conscience, because the violence is collective, because the enemy has been officially designated, because everyone around them is doing the same thing. The shadow moves in crowds the way fire moves in dry grass. Each individual flame is small. Together they become something that consumes everything. The witch hunt, the purge, the pogrom, the show trial. These are not aberrations committed by an entirely different species of human being, by people who were simply born evil in a way that we are not. They are the shadow mechanism at scale, supplied with ideology and permission and a list of names. The people who carried them out were, many of them, people who considered themselves good. Some of them were, in the private dimensions of their lives, kind to their families, generous to their friends, pious in their prayers, none of which prevented them from participating in the exiling of the scapegoat, because the shadow does not care about your private virtues. It only cares about whether it has been looked at. Let us breathe for a moment. This is heavy material, and it should be heavy. We are not going to rush past it. Let the body settle into the chair or the pillow. Let the weight of what we are considering be real for a moment rather than abstracted away. The lamp is still lit. We are still here. We will continue. Jung's position after the war was not comfortable. He argued that Germany's crimes required a reckoning not only in Germany, but in all of humanity. He included himself. He wrote that the line between the people who had done these things and the people who had watched or benefited or looked away was not a line between different kinds of human beings. It was a line drawn by circumstance, by the particular historical moment, by which country's collective shadow happened to erupt on which particular decade. And here is where a man from a very different tradition and a very different context arrived at the same threshold by a completely different road. Alexander Solzhenitsyn spent years in the Soviet labor camp system, in the Gulag, as a prisoner of a political regime that had its own version of the collective shadow, its own designated enemies, its own official scapegoats. He watched what the system did to the people who ran it, as well as to the people who suffered under it. And out of that experience he wrote The Gulag Archipelago, one of the most morally serious books of the 20th century. And in that book he made an observation that runs so close to Jung's that the parallel seems almost designed, even though the two men were coming from entirely different places. Solzhenitsyn wrote, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Not between people, not between groups, between nations, between the good ones and the bad ones, through every human heart, without exception, including his own." This is not a comfortable sentence. It is meant to be uncomfortable. Solzhenitsyn had every reason, having suffered what he suffered, to draw the line between himself and his oppressors, to place the evil cleanly over there in the people who ran the camps, the people who gave the orders, the people who carried them out. He had earned the right to that clarity, and he refused it. Not because he was being falsely modest or performing a philosophical nicety, but because he had looked long enough at the reality of what human beings do to one another and at what he himself was capable of, to know that the line was not where comfortable morality wanted to place it. Jung could have written that sentence. In some ways he did write it, in different words, in different books, over the course of a long life thinking about the shadow. The line does not run between the good and the bad, it runs through everyone. The shadow is not something only bad people have. It is something every human being has in proportion, roughly, to how much they have tried to be only good. There is a natural question that arises here, and it is an honest one, and it deserves a careful answer rather than a dismissal. Does this mean that all shadows are equivalent? Does this mean that the person who carries the shadow of small vanities and the person who carried the shadow of large cruelties are in the same position? Does this mean that because the line runs through every heart, no distinctions can be made? No, Jung was careful about this, and it is worth being careful here too. In Aion, paragraph 19, he made a distinction that matters enormously for what we are discussing. He wrote that the personal shadow, the particular accumulated material of one individual life, one particular ego's sorting of acceptable and unacceptable, is of the same nature as the ego itself and is therefore, in principle, assimilable. It can be integrated, it can be made conscious, worked with, owned. This is the shadow you can actually do something about. But he also wrote that beneath and behind the personal shadow, there are darker layers, what he called archetypal or collective evil, depths that are not reducible to any individual's biography and are not fully integrable through personal effort alone. The personal shadow is a sealed room in a house you can eventually enter. These deeper layers are not a room at all. They are something vaster and older and different in kind. This distinction matters for two reasons. One is practical. When we talk about shadow work, about catching the disproportionate reaction and asking what it reflects, we are talking about the personal shadow, the layer that is genuinely accessible to a person who is willing to look. We are not claiming that every evil can be resolved through enough self-examination, or that the right kind of introspection would have stopped any particular historical atrocity if enough people had practiced it. That would be a naive claim, and Jung did not make it. The second reason the distinction matters is moral. Acknowledging that the line runs through every heart is not the same as saying that all actions are equivalent, or that perpetrators and victims occupy the same position, or that structural evil is merely the sum of everyone's unexamined projections. These are different things, and collapsing them would be a serious misreading of what Jung was actually arguing. What he was arguing was more specific and more honest. He was arguing that the mechanism, the underlying psychological architecture, is shared. That a person who hasn't looked at their own shadow is not in a position to look clearly at the shadows of others because they will be projecting. That the individual who does the interior work becomes, in some modest but real way, less available to be recruited by the collective shadow mechanism, less willing to load the sins of the community onto a designated outsider and drive them out, not immune, less available. He wrote in The Undiscovered Self that the individual is the make-weight that tips the scales. One by one, the person who has faced what is in them becomes slightly more resistant to the contagion. Slightly, not perfectly. But the alternative, which is to work only at the collective level, to try to fix the political systems and the social structures without touching the psychic material underneath, was, in his view, insufficient. Not wrong, insufficient. Because the structures are built by human beings who carry their shadows with them, and the structures will reflect that regardless of what the official ideology says about itself. This is a sobering position. It does not let anyone off the hook, including the people who consider themselves progressive or enlightened or on the right side of history. The shadow mechanism is not aligned with ideology. It operates through anyone who has not looked at it. The righteous mob and the mob that considers itself righteous carry the same dynamic, wearing different costumes. The lamp is still lit. We are still walking. Let us pause here for a breath. Take a slow, deep breath in. Let it settle into the belly rather than the chest, if that is available to you tonight. And breathe out slowly. Notice whatever the body is holding right now, not to solve it, not to judge it, just to know it is there. When you are ready, we will continue. There is something that often happens when people encounter this material for the first time, this idea that the shadow scales, that the mechanism of personal projection is the same engine that powers collective violence. What happens is a kind of vertigo, a sense that the problem is too large, too structural, too distributed across too many people's inner lives to be addressed. And underneath the vertigo sometimes is a quiet despair. If this is the mechanism, and the mechanism is in everyone, and the mechanism builds when you try hardest to suppress it, then what exactly is one supposed to do? This is the question we are walking toward. We are not quite there yet. There is one more piece of this room to examine before we move into the next one, and it is a piece that most discussions of the shadow, including many that invoke Jung's name, leave out entirely. Because here is what you need to understand about the sealed room. The sealed room is not full only of darkness. Jung was explicit about this, careful about it, emphatic in a way that got lost in the cultural shorthand that followed. What he actually wrote in the 9th volume of his collected works, paragraph 423, is this: the shadow contains, besides the inferior characteristics and the morally reprehensible tendencies, a number of good qualities, normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses, and so on. Read that again if you like. Not just the dark things, not just the morally reprehensible tendencies, also the good qualities, also the normal instincts, also the realistic insights, the creative impulses, the appropriate reactions. This is the part of the story that almost no popular discussion of the shadow acknowledges. The shadow is not simply a repository of what is evil in us. It is a repository of what was not permitted. And not everything that is not permitted is evil. Some of it was forbidden because it was inconvenient, or threatening to someone else's comfort, or out of step with the particular tribe's particular values, or simply too alive, too strong, too individual for the container that was offered. A child who is too exuberant is taught to be quieter. A child who is too curious is taught to be more obedient. A child whose anger is large and legitimate is taught that anger is not permitted. A child who wants to make art is told that art is not a living. A child who is tender in a family that values toughness learns to close off the tenderness. A child who is ambitious in a family that fears ambition learns to apologize for wanting things. None of these things put in the bag are evil. They are alive, they are part of a person, and they go into the bag anyway, not because they were monstrous, but because the environment did not have room for them. And then later in life, this person encounters someone who is exuberant, or angry, or ambitious, or tender in the way they were not permitted to be, and what do they feel? Not simply disapproval. Something hotter than that. Something disproportionate. The reaction that the Jungian clinical literature has consistently identified as the fingerprint of projection, the marker that what you are seeing in the other person is not only what is in the other person, but what is in you, locked in the sealed room, denied and pressurizing for 30 or 40 years. The exuberant person annoys you because you buried your exuberance. The ambitious person makes you uncomfortable because you learn to muffle your ambition. The person who speaks their anger clearly and without apology enrages you in a way that feels moral, feels righteous, feels like disapproval of their excess, but underneath it is the rage of someone who was never allowed to do that and resents, at a depth below conscious access, that someone else gets to. Robert A. Johnson, a Jungian analyst who wrote a small and elegant book in 1991 called Owning Your Own Shadow, described this using an image that has stayed in the conversation ever since. He spoke of the gold in the shadow, the buried treasure that is not treasure because it is dark, but treasure because it is yours, and it was taken from you, or you gave it away under pressure before you knew what you were surrendering. The gold, not only the dark, both. And the gold, in some ways, is harder to retrieve than the dark, because the dark, at least, announces itself as something to be worked on. The gold is buried under shame and prohibition and old stories about who you were allowed to be, and retrieving it requires not only courage but a kind of grief, a mourning for the life that was not lived, the voice that was not used, the strength that was not permitted to develop. We will walk more slowly through this part of the story in the next room, the room where the whole question of what to actually do with any of this opens up. But it is important to say it here, in this room, so that the full picture is visible. The shadow is not only what you are afraid you might become, it is also what you have not yet allowed yourself to be. The man who explodes at the trash bins may be releasing his anger, yes, but he may also, if he were ever to sit with it long enough rather than just discharging it, find underneath the anger something else. A grief, perhaps. A long-held sorrow about what he was not permitted to feel. A buried tenderness, a creative life he did not live, a voice he trained himself not to use. These are not comfortable discoveries. They are also not only dark. The neighbor with the trash bins did not put any of that there, but he was inadvertently holding the door open to it. That is what Jung meant when he wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The irritation is a thread. It is not always a pleasant thread, but it goes somewhere, and where it goes is not the neighbor. Where it goes is inward. Let the body be still for a moment. Let the eyes close if they have not already. The night is doing its quiet work. We are doing ours. There is still more room in this house. We have been walking through the mechanics of how the shadow forms, how it scales from the private life to the public square, how it holds not only darkness, but displaced gold. And we have circled more than once around the question that sits at the center of everything Jung wrote about the shadow. The question the title of our night's conversation is really asking. What do you do with it? We are almost at that door. But before we open it, one more thing needs to be said about the room we are standing in now. This room of the scaled shadow, the collective machinery. Because it would be easy, having heard all of this, to look outward, to say, yes, I can see this mechanism at work out there in the groups I already disapprove of, in the political movements I already distrust, in the people I already find easy to blame. It would be easy and it would be wrong. The shadow mechanism is not a tool for identifying other people's shadows. It is a mirror, and the mirror only works when it is pointed inward. This is perhaps the most consistent and the most demanding thing Jung said across his entire body of work. The person who uses the idea of projection as evidence that other people are projecting without first applying it to themselves has not understood the idea. They have found a new vocabulary for the old game. The shadow does not announce itself as shadow, it announces itself as clarity. It announces itself as righteous perception of genuine flaws in others. It announces itself as finally seeing things as they really are. The signal that you are in it is not confusion. The signal is certainty, particularly the hot, righteous certainty that is disproportionate to its occasion. Solzhenitsyn knew this. He knew it in the camps, watching guards who were certain they were serving justice, watching prisoners who were certain they were purely innocent, watching himself in both of those mirrors at once. The line through every heart. Through every heart. Jung knew it too. And after the war, when the world was inclined to draw a clean line between the Germans who had done these things and the rest of humanity who had not, he refused the comfort. He said that the correct response was not to look outward at Germany in horror and confirm one's own innocence. The correct response was to look inward, to ask what one's own nation had buried, what one's own community had projected, what one's own heart was capable of under different conditions and different permissions. This is not a popular thing to say in the aftermath of atrocity. It is also, Jung believed, the only thing that might actually help, because the alternative, which is to locate evil cleanly over there and consider the matter closed, is the projection mechanism continuing to operate with a new set of materials and a new set of righteous feelings. The night is deep now, the house is quiet. We have walked through a number of rooms and we are carrying more than we came in with. That is as it should be. The walking was never meant to lighten the load by ignoring what is in it. The walking was meant to help us know what we are carrying. Because here is the thing that is true, that Jung spent a long career insisting on, that Solzhenitsyn wrote down in the permafrost and carried out of Siberia in his memory. What we carry, but do not know we are carrying, does not stay in the bag. It goes somewhere. It goes into the marriage, it goes into the grudge, it goes into the disproportionate flash of fury at a neighbor or a colleague or a stranger on the internet whose particular failing makes your blood run hotter than the situation warrants. And at scale, it goes into the scapegoat, into the purge, into the long history of human beings loading their disowned material onto other human beings and calling it justice. What we carry and know we are carrying is different, not resolved, not eliminated, not clean and safe and finished, but known, held with some degree of awareness, available to be worked with rather than only discharged. The door to that is still ahead of us. We are going to walk through it together. For now, let the breath be slow. Let the weight of this material settle rather than be pushed away. It is not pleasant, all of it. It was never going to be pleasant. But there is a reason, and we will come to it, why Jung said the thing that is perhaps the most unexpected sentence he ever wrote about the shadow, the sentence that overturns the grim lecture this could have been and opens into something else entirely. He said he would rather be whole than good, not bad, not unbounded, not without values or without care, whole. And wholeness, he meant, includes what you have sealed away, both the darkness and the gold, both the shadow and the light, both the capacity for cruelty and the buried tenderness, both the exiled anger and the unlived ambition, both the man at the trash bins and the man who has not yet exploded but is carrying a denser shadow than the one who did. Whole is not comfortable. Whole is not presentable at every dinner party. Whole does not look as clean as the polished mask, but whole is honest. And whole, in Jung's understanding, is the only thing that actually works, the only arrangement of the interior life that does not eventually turn into a pressure system that must blow outward when the door can no longer hold. We are almost at the room where we will open all of this up, where we will look at what the work actually is, what integration actually means, rather than what the lazy version of it says, why it is hard in a specific and predictable way, and what you find when you are willing to go into the sealed room, not to destroy what is in it, but to know it. The lamp is still lit. We will keep walking. And here is the thing that most versions of this story leave out. They tell you about the darkness in the shadow. They dwell there, rightly, because it is real, and because it matters, and because a person who does not know their capacity for cruelty is dangerous. But they stop there. They leave you in the sealed room with only what frightened you. They do not tell you what else is in there. Jung himself, in the 9th volume of his collected works, the section called conscious, unconscious, and individuation, wrote something that requires reading twice before it lands. He wrote that the shadow contains, and this is the exact territory he named, quote, good qualities, normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses. He was not softening the diagnosis, he was completing it. The shadow is not a waste bin, it is also a vault. And in many people, perhaps in most people, what was placed in the vault was not only the material they were ashamed of, but the material that others were threatened by. The parts that were too large, too strong, too alive. Robert A. Johnson, a Jungian analyst who spent decades making this framework navigable for ordinary people, wrote in his 1991 book, Owning Your Own Shadow, about what he called the gold in the shadow. Johnson was careful to credit Jung for the concept, while noting that the gold metaphor was his own way of making it picturable. Gold because it is precious. Gold because it was put away, not because it was worthless, but because someone at some point told the child that this particular kind of shining was not allowed here. Think of what gets put in the bag, not only the rage, the neediness, the hunger for attention, the meanness, the jealousy, those go in, but so does the ambition that a parent called selfish, so does the artistic impulse that a family called impractical, so does the anger that a culture coded as unfeminine, or the tenderness that a culture coded as weak, so does the sexuality that a religion declared dangerous. So does the exuberance that a classroom teacher declared disruptive, the laughter that was too loud, the opinion that was too strong, the grief that made adults uncomfortable, the wildness that a neighborhood had no place for. All of it went in, not because it was bad, because it was inconvenient, because it did not fit the version of the child that the surrounding adults needed in order to feel safe or comfortable or proud. The bag was not filled with poison, it was filled with whatever the world did not know what to do with. And then the person grew up, and the bag came with them. And what is in the bag does not stay inert. Sealed material has a kind of pressure. It wants to move, it pushes at the seams, and because the door is locked, it finds other ways out. It comes out as projection. As we have been walking through, it comes out as the flash of fury at the colleague who is too openly ambitious, when ambition is what you sealed away. It comes out as the contempt for the person who is too emotional, when emotion is what you were never permitted to show. It comes out as the inexplicable irritation at someone who takes up space confidently, when your own confidence was one of the first things put in the bag. This is why the mirror is not only showing you darkness, sometimes it is showing you unlived life. The person whose confidence enrages you may not be doing something wrong. They may be doing something you were told you were not allowed to do, and the rage is not moral clarity, but grief. Grief for the confidence that went into the bag at age 7 when someone told you that you were too much. The anger is real, but its object is misidentified. You are not angry at them. You are angry at the loss of something that was yours and was taken, or that you handed away because the cost of keeping it felt too high. Let that settle for a moment, because it changes the shape of the thing considerably. If what irritates you most can lead to self-understanding, as Jung said, and if what you meet in that understanding is not only your capacity for the dark, but your buried capacity for light, for strength, for aliveness, then the sealed room is not a chamber of punishment. It is a room you were locked out of, and some of what is inside you have been missing. You have been walking through years slightly diminished, slightly less than the full version of yourself, because the fuller version had parts that someone once, in some context, declared inadmissible. Robert Bly, the poet who gave us the long bag image in his 1988 book, A Little Book on the Human Shadow, said that we spend the first 20 years of life filling the bag and the rest of life trying to retrieve what we put inside it. He was being generous with the timeline. Some people spend 60 years filling it and die without ever opening it. Some people catch a glimpse of the bag in their 50s and spend the last decades of their lives in the strange, tender work of reclamation. Some people never look at all. And this is where the question that was seeded earlier in the night finds its answer. The question about why almost no one actually does this work, even after they understand it, even after they have read the book, or listened to the voice in the dark, or nodded along to every paragraph and felt the recognition moving through them like a current. Jung himself named it. In Aion, the same 1951 text that gave us the shadow's most precise definition, he wrote that becoming conscious of the shadow involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real, and that this act, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. Not mild discomfort, not slight reluctance, considerable resistance. The mind does not want to see it. The defenses that keep the shadow sealed are not passive walls, they are active, they push back, they generate exactly the responses that prevent the turning, dismissal, projection, rationalization, rage, contempt, distraction, busyness, the sudden certainty that someone else is the problem. Every time you move toward genuine self-recognition, something in the interior architecture generates a reason to look away. The shadow defends itself. It is not a passive, locked room. It is a locked room with a mechanism on the inside that rattles the handle back at you every time you reach for the key. This is not a personal failing, this is the structure of the thing. Jung understood that the resistance is built in, that it is part of what makes shadow work a genuine moral and psychological project rather than a pleasant afternoon of self-reflection. It is genuinely hard, not because you are weak, because the defenses were built specifically to resist exactly this kind of looking. And there is an additional layer that makes it harder still. The shadow, precisely because it is unconscious, does not feel like something you possess. It feels like something that exists in the world, in them. The mechanism of projection is so seamless, so total, so utterly convincing that when you are in its grip, you do not experience yourself as projecting. You experience yourself as perceiving accurately. The colleague is truly arrogant. The family member is genuinely without boundaries. The stranger online is demonstrably the kind of person who ought to be publicly corrected. The feeling of righteous clarity is the proof from inside the projection that it is not a projection at all. This is what makes the disproportionate charge so important as a diagnostic. Because the quality of the feeling is the only available signal that the thermometer has been thrown off. Ordinary disagreement is cool. Ordinary dislike is manageable. But the flash of fury, the particular kind of moral outrage that exceeds anything the situation actually warrants, the inexplicable contempt that arrives fully formed before you have thought it through, the irritation that keeps returning even when there is no fresh trigger, that quality, that heat, that is the fingerprint of the shadow. In 1997, researchers working under the heading of social psychology at a level that has nothing to do with Jungian metaphysics published a study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. The researchers were Newman, Duff, and Baumeister. What they found through experimental design was that when people suppress a trait in themselves, when they push it away from conscious self-concept, they become more ready to perceive that trait in others. Not less ready, more ready. The act of suppression makes the denied material more available as a lens for viewing the world, not less. The suppressed angry person sees anger everywhere. The suppressed ambitious person sees selfishness in everyone who is openly driven. The suppressed fearful person identifies cowardice in others with unusual speed and certainty. This is not proof of everything Jung meant by the shadow. The study does not validate Jungian psychology in its full scope. Jung was writing within a framework of depth psychology that is broader and less experimentally constrained than what social psychologists test in a laboratory. But it is a convergence, it is an independent body of modern research arriving at a finding that rhymes deeply with what Jung described from a different direction using different methods nearly a century earlier. The trait you suppress becomes the trait you see. The quality you exile from your own self-image becomes the quality you find most visible, most objectionable, most morally urgent to condemn in others. That convergence is worth noting, not as proof, but as the kind of confirmation from an unexpected direction that makes a conceptual framework feel less like speculation and more like a map drawn by multiple cartographers of the same real terrain. And so to the question of what the work actually is, because this is where the most important correction lives. The popular version of shadow integration, if you have encountered it in self-help contexts, often sounds like one of two things. Either it sounds like embracing your dark side, which means something vague about permission and authenticity and doing what you feel, or it sounds like an elimination project, a cleaning, a healing that finishes, after which you are no longer afflicted by the problem. Neither of these is what Jung meant, and both of them, followed to their conclusions, make things worse rather than better. Embracing your dark side as an instruction is not shadow integration, it is shadow acting out. A person who suppresses anger and then decides the answer is to express every flash of rage as it arrives has not integrated the anger. They have simply moved from unconscious suppression to unconscious expression. The anger is still running the show. The person is still not in conscious relationship with the quality. They have simply switched from one form of unconsciousness to another. The shadow has not been met. It has been given a stage pass. And the elimination project, the healing that finishes fantasy, mistakes the nature of what the shadow is. The shadow is not a disease. It is not a wound that closes. It is a structural feature of having a conscious ego that cannot hold everything at once. As long as you have a self, you have a shadow. As long as there are things you prefer not to be and qualities you have decided are not part of your identity, the complementary material will exist somewhere in the dark. This does not go away. This is not a problem to be solved. It is a relationship to be maintained. What Jung meant by integration was this: conscious relationship. The integrated shadow is not an absent shadow or a tamed shadow. It is a known shadow. It is the difference between a quality that operates on you from below without your awareness and the same quality that you are awake to in yourself, that you can recognize as it moves in you, that you can choose deliberately rather than be driven by. The integrated angry person is not rage-free. They know their anger. They have met it, named it, understood its origin and its uses. They are no longer at its mercy because they are no longer surprised by it. When it moves, they see it move and they decide. That is the work. Not elimination. Not permission. Conscious relationship. Jung's overarching word for this process, the lifelong project of becoming conscious of everything that has been disowned and meeting it honestly, was individuation. The German word is individuation, and the concept behind it is not self-improvement in any ordinary sense. It is not becoming better, it is becoming whole. The distinction matters enormously. Becoming better, in the way the word is usually meant, implies a direction, a moral trajectory, a shedding of what is beneath you in favor of what is above. Individuation moves in a different geometry. It does not move upward through a hierarchy of improvements. It moves outward to include what has been left out, downward to reclaim what was buried. It is expansion rather than elevation. It is the slow retrieval of what was placed in the bag. And this is why Jung said, in one of the sentences most associated with his thinking on this subject, that he would rather be whole than good. The verbatim phrasing is contested at the edges, tagged with appropriate caution as the popular form of a position that is unambiguously and consistently his throughout the collected works, but the concept is T1, first tier verified, load-bearing, wholeness rather than goodness as the aim, because goodness as a project requires exile. It requires that certain parts be declared not good and expelled, and everything expelled thickens in the dark and erupts from below when the pressure becomes too great. Wholeness asks instead that you stay in relationship with all of it, not to act it all out, not to collapse into it, but to know it, to say, yes, this is in me, and to hold it consciously rather than discover it in the world wearing someone else's face. The practice, then, is not mysterious. It is simple to describe, though not simple to do. Simple in the way that a difficult physical skill is simple to describe. Do this, and then this, and then this. The doing is another matter. You catch the disproportionate charge. You notice that the heat of what you are feeling exceeds what the situation reasonably calls for. The colleague says something mildly self-promoting, and something in you goes white with contempt before you have thought a word. You catch that. You name it to yourself. This is larger than it should be. Then you ask the question, not what is wrong with them, not what is wrong with me. The question is more specific than either of those. What is this person doing that I forbid in myself? What quality are they expressing or embodying that I have decided is not available to me, not permitted to me, not safe to be? What did I put in the bag that looks like this? Sometimes the answer arrives immediately. You recognize it before the question is finished, of course. This is ambition, and I was taught that wanting too much made you dangerous or selfish or unloved. Of course. This is the willingness to set limits, and I learned early that having limits made people abandon you. Of course. This is the capacity to take up space, and the family I grew up in had no room for anyone who took up space without apology. Sometimes the answer does not arrive immediately. Sometimes you sit with the question and nothing clear comes, and the sitting is still the work, because the act of turning toward rather than away is itself the practice. The question is more important than the speed of the answer. The willingness to inquire is more important than the instant solution. Marie-Louise von Franz, who worked with Jung for decades and who gave us the most practical articulations of how the shadow moves, described in Man and His Symbols the emotional reaction that exceeds its trigger as the diagnostic fingerprint. She was not offering this as a theory to agree or disagree with. She was offering it as a clinical observation. When the reaction outstrips the stimulus, something else is involved, something from the inside, something from the bag, and you can trace it back. That is the other piece of the practice, because the shadow was not always shadow. It was not born dark. It was ordinary material, ordinary parts of the self that became shadow in a specific context, at a specific time, for a specific reason. The anger that now erupts in disproportionate ways was once a child's reasonable response to something that hurt. The neediness that now feels shameful was once a child's ordinary request for what children need. The ambition that now comes out as envy or contempt was once a genuine aspiration that someone made too expensive to carry openly. If you can find the moment, or something like the moment, when the quality was first declared inadmissible, you can begin to separate it from the verdict that was passed on it. You can begin to see it as yours rather than as evidence of your defectiveness. This is the gold. This is what Johnson meant by the gold mining metaphor that he drew from Jung's own text in the collected works. Not that everything in the shadow is secretly wonderful. There is real darkness in there too, real capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for harm. That also needs to be known. But for many people, the sealed room contains more gold than monster. And the first genuine shock of shadow work is not discovering how bad they are, but discovering how much they have been withholding from themselves, how diminished they have been walking, how much of their own life they have been not quite living because the fuller version was declared too risky. The person who was told their anger was dangerous and sealed it away may discover on the other side of that door that what they sealed was not rage but discernment, the capacity to say this is wrong and to mean it, the ability to hold a limit against something that genuinely deserves a limit. Anger in its healthy form is a boundary marker. It says here and no further, this matters, this cannot continue. A person who cannot access their own anger is not a peaceful person. They are a person who cannot defend anything, including the people and values they love. The anger in the bag was not the enemy of their goodness, it was one of its instruments, made unavailable. The person who was told their ambition was selfish and sealed it away may find that what they actually sealed was their sense of purpose, their feeling of mattering, their drive towards something that felt genuinely theirs. Ambition stripped of grandiosity is simply caring about what you do. It is wanting to do it well. A person who has exiled their ambition is not necessarily a humble person. They may be a person who has quietly stopped believing their life has direction and who experiences that stoppage as vague depression or as furious contempt for the people who are still going somewhere. The person who sealed their sexuality, their body, their pleasure in being embodied and alive may find on the other side of that door something the culture needed to manage and managed badly, something that was never the threat it was declared to be, but only a natural appetite that required no more than ordinary human wisdom to navigate. And perhaps the most quietly devastating one, the person who was told that their way of thinking, their creativity, their particular kind of intelligence was impractical or too strange or not what this family or this school or this workplace needed, and who sealed that away may find on the other side a person they have never gotten to be. An unlived version of themselves that has been knocking at the door for 20 or 30 or 50 years while they lived the acceptable version, competently, dutifully, with a persistent, low-grade grief they could never quite name. This is why Jung called it individuation rather than therapy, rather than healing, rather than improvement, because the task is not fixing what is broken. The task is becoming more fully who you are, including the parts that were sealed for safekeeping, including the parts that were declared inadmissible by people who had their own sealed rooms and their own unretrieved gold. There is a line Jung wrote in The Philosophical Tree, which is collected in the 13th volume of the Collected Works, paragraph 335. It is the sentence that belongs at the end of this kind of journey, not because it is a comfortable sentence, but because it is a precise one. He wrote, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, not by adding more light, not by imagining ourselves into brightness, not by focusing on the positive, as the contemporary version of this era puts it, by making the darkness conscious, by turning toward it, naming it, knowing it, staying in relationship with it, by doing the thing that the interior architecture will resist at almost every step, because the defenses are active and the habit of turning away is old and deeply grooved. This does not end. That is the honest thing to say at the close of all of this. There is no point at which the shadow is fully retrieved, fully known, fully integrated, and then finished with. Individuation is a lifelong process. The bag refills. New life stages bring new material that does not fit the persona you have built for that stage. New relationships bring new surfaces that your shadow can write itself onto. New pressures compact the old material and create new layers. The work is not a project with a completion date. It is more like a practice. Something you return to, something you keep in relationship with, the way you keep in relationship with anyone you have chosen not to exile. But it changes. The person who has done even a small, genuine piece of this work is different from the person who has not. Not better in the simple moral sense, more awake, more honest about what they carry, less likely to be ambushed by their own interior. less likely to need an enemy in order to feel clean, less likely to look at the person across the table and find, without knowing why, that something in them fills you with a fury that has nowhere to land. And there is this too, which perhaps redeems the whole architecture of projection more than anything else we have looked at tonight. Because projection is painful, the person who lives inside it is, in a specific and measurable way, making the world smaller and more hostile and more distorted with every flash of disproportionate charge. But projection is also, for exactly this reason, a map. The people who irritate you most, the ones who fill you with that particular quality of outrage that exceeds the situation, they are not obstacles. They are not evidence of how degenerate the world has become. They are not proof that you are surrounded by exactly the kind of people who make everything harder. They are teachers. Unwitting ones, usually. They did not set out to show you your own unknown face. They simply lived in a way that was visible to you, and the visibility hit something sealed and old and yours. They walked into the beam and lit up the shape of what is still in the bag. If you can stay with the irritation long enough to ask the question, what is this person doing that I forbid in myself? You are not weakening your position or letting bad behavior off the hook. You are doing something far more interesting. You are using the world's most reliable signal for your own unretrieved interior. You are turning what would otherwise be wasted outrage into information. You are using the person who enrages you the way a doctor uses a symptom, not to excuse the symptom, not to pretend it is not real, but to ask what it is pointing toward. The enemy in this frame is a gift. The word gift sounds too easy, too packaged, too self-help positive for what is actually a difficult and sometimes humbling recognition. But in the specific, technical sense that Jung meant it, the projection onto the enemy returns the shadow to you. The enemy holds the material you exiled, and if the material is held by the enemy, then engagement with the enemy, real engagement rather than merely reactionary contempt, engagement that includes the question, what am I seeing in them that I will not look at in myself? That engagement is the beginning of retrieval. This does not mean the enemy is right. This does not mean the enemy's behavior requires no response. Some behaviors require clear responses regardless of what projection is running alongside them. A person who is genuinely being harmed is not obligated to treat their harmer primarily as a mirror. The nuance matters. The absolute version of the mirror metaphor, the one that says everything you dislike is merely your own projection and nothing out there is real, is wrong. Jung was not saying that. Jung was saying that when the charge is disproportionate, when the heat exceeds the occasion, something from the inside is involved. Not always, not as an Aion law, but frequently. Frequently enough that the question is worth asking every time. And when you ask it, and when the answer comes, and when you stand in front of the sealed room with the key in your hand, and the resistance already building its case for why you should put the key down and walk back to the comfortable life of the polished mask. Remember what Jung said about that moment. He said it meets with considerable resistance. He was not being discouraging. He was being accurate. The resistance is not a sign that you are doing it wrong. The resistance is a sign that you are doing it. It is the pressure of the door pushing back because something on the other side has been in there long enough that the door itself has become load-bearing, but the door is yours, the room is yours, the material inside is yours. And it has been waiting as all things sealed away and patient wait for the moment when you are ready to know it. You do not need to open the whole room tonight. This is not that kind of work. It is slow, it is ongoing, it is done in small moments and small questions and small recognitions, accumulated over time the way any genuine knowing of another person or of yourself accumulates. Not in one revelation, but in a long series of smaller ones, each leaving you slightly more awake than you were before. What you can take with you into the quiet is this. The next time a particular kind of fury arrives, that specific heat that is too large and too sudden and too absolute to be only about what is in front of you, you will recognize it for what it is. Not evidence that the world is full of the wrong kind of people, a signal, a piece of the map, a knock at the door of the sealed room from the inside. And somewhere in that sealed room, alongside whatever genuinely needs to be held carefully and consciously and not simply acted out, there is material that is yours and that you have been missing. There are qualities that were declared inadmissible at an age when you had no power to argue. There are parts of your own life that have been waiting to be lived. There is anger that was really boundaries. There is ambition that was really purpose. There is whatever particular brightness in you that someone at some point made too expensive to carry. They were wrong about the price. The darkness is real. The work is hard. The resistance is built in. And the gold is genuinely in there. We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Jung wrote that. He wrote it as the most honest instruction he could offer after a life spent in the interior territory of the human psyche, watching what happens when the shadow is met and what happens when it is not. Not comfort, consciousness, not the warm image of light imagined into existence, but the actual turning toward the actual dark, with the lamp held steady and the question asked sincerely. That is the whole of it. The shadow forms because consciousness cannot hold everything. The bag fills because the world requires a presentable version and the rest must go somewhere. The projection runs because what is sealed finds other surfaces to write itself on. The disproportionate charge arrives as a signal because the interior has no other language for showing you what it contains. The fury at the other is often grief for the self. The irritation at what they freely are is often longing for what you were told you could not be. The darkness repressed thickens rather than clearing. The attempt to be only good manufactures the monster. And the monster, when met honestly and held consciously, rather than projected outward or acted blindly out, turns out to be carrying, alongside the real darkness, a portion of your own unlived life. This is what Carl Gustav Jung was pointing at across all of it, not a self-help program, not a 5-step method, a description of how the interior of a human life actually works when you are willing to look at it without flattering yourself or frightening yourself into paralysis, honest, uncomfortable. And at the end of the discomfort, something that feels more like freedom than the polished mask ever did. The lamp has been lit all the way through. You have been carrying it. Take a slow breath now. Feel where you are. The weight of the blanket, the sound of the quiet, whatever is present around you in this particular darkness, that is just the ordinary darkness of a room at rest. You do not need to remember all of it. If one thing stayed, let that be the one. The next flash of disproportionate fury, the question it is carrying, the door it is standing in front of, that is enough for one night. More than enough. We have walked a long way together through the interior country that Jung spent his life mapping. We have met the shadow in its formation, in its projection, in its collective eruption, in its resistance, and finally in its gold. We have met Bly's bag and Johnson's mining metaphor, and von Franz's dream figure, and Solzhenitsyn's line that cuts through every heart, and the researchers in 1997 who arrived from a different country entirely at the same terrain. We have met the scapegoat and the purge and the marriage that became a mirror, and the saint who detonated and the ordinary person who was simply handed too tight a mask to wear. And we have met at the end the possibility that the sealed room is not only a place of danger but a place of retrieval, that some of what is in the bag is your own. The morning will come with its ordinary requirements. The people in your life will arrive again with their particular qualities that generate their particular charges in you. The bag will go with you, as it always has, because the bag is not a problem to be finally solved. It is a relationship to be maintained. But perhaps you will catch it a little sooner. Perhaps the question will arrive a little faster. Perhaps the next time the world shows you your own unknown face in someone else's expression, you will recognize it not as an accusation, but as an invitation. Enough stories for one night. Off to sleep now, Grandpa says.